The ice core sample sat under the microscope like 1,000 others before it. Dr. Rebecca Hart had been studying frozen materials from dead worlds for 6 years now, and she expected this one to be just as boring as the rest. Her research vessel floated near a small moon that nobody had bothered to name, and her job was to figure out if anything had ever lived here. Most days the answer was no. She adjusted the microscope settings and leaned closer. Something glinted inside the ice. Rebecca frowned and increased the magnification. 2 tiny objects, each no bigger than a pinhead, sat frozen in the ancient ice. They looked like crystals at first, but crystals did not have that kind of internal structure. She could see layers, patterns, something that looked almost like scales. "David, come look at this," she called out. David Cole wandered over from the engineering station, wiping grease from his hands. He was supposed to be fixing the atmospheric recycler, but he never minded an excuse to stop working. "What did you find? Another frozen bacteria?" "I don't know what it is," Rebecca admitted. She stepped back so he could look. David peered through the microscope and whistled softly. "Those look like eggs. That's what I thought too. But they're so small, and the structure is wrong for anything in our database." Rebecca pulled up her computer and started running analysis programs. The results made no sense. The objects contained genetic material, but it was like nothing she had ever seen. The DNA strands were triple helixed instead of double, and they seemed to generate their own energy somehow. "Should we try to hatch them?" David asked. Rebecca hesitated. Every protocol said she should catalog the finding and send it to the main research facility. But that would take months, and by then, who knew what condition these eggs would be in? "Let's warm them up slowly," she decided, just to see what happens. They placed the ice sample in a warming chamber and watched. For 3 hours, nothing changed. Rebecca was about to give up when the ice finally melted. The 2 tiny eggs sat in a drop of water, and then they started to glow. The glow was soft at first, like moonlight. Then it grew brighter. The eggs cracked, and 2 creatures emerged. They were impossibly small, each one no bigger than a grain of rice. They had 4 legs, 2 wings, and long tails. Their scales shimmered with colors that seemed to shift between white and blue on one creature, and red and gold on the other. "Those are dragons," David whispered. "Dragons don't exist," Rebecca said automatically, but she could not stop staring. The tiny creatures stretched their wings and looked around with bright, intelligent eyes. Then they looked directly at her. Something warm flooded through Rebecca's chest. It was not quite a feeling and not quite a thought. It was more like a sense of recognition, of coming home after a long journey. The white and blue dragon chirped softly, and Rebecca understood somehow that it was greeting her. "I think they like us," David said. His voice sounded strange, and Rebecca realized he was feeling it too. That sense of connection, of belonging. The red and gold dragon hopped over to David's finger when he held it out. The creature was so light he could barely feel it, but its tiny claws gripped his skin gently. It looked up at him and chirped, and David smiled wider than Rebecca had seen in months. "We need names for them," Rebecca said. She carefully picked up the white and blue dragon. It curled up in her palm, already trusting her completely. "This one looks like ice and snow. I'll call her Frost." "Then this one is Nova," David said, watching the red and gold dragon explore his hand, "because she's bright and warm." Over the next few days, Rebecca and David discovered just how strange their new companions were. Frost and Nova did not eat regular food. Instead, they seemed to absorb energy directly from their surroundings. They could survive in vacuum without any protection, and they generated their own heat. When Rebecca ran their genetic code through the ship's database, she got 0 matches. These creatures were not related to anything humanity had ever discovered. Even stranger was how fast they grew. Within a week, both dragons were the size of mice. They could fly now, zooming around the research vessel and exploring everything. They understood human speech, or at least they understood emotions. When Rebecca felt sad, Frost would curl up against her neck and purr. When David was frustrated with a repair, Nova would bring him tools, somehow knowing which one he needed. The ship's AI finally processed all the data and delivered its report. "These creatures match no known species in the Galactic database," it announced. "Their genetic structure contains sequences that predate any recorded civilization. Recommendation: report to authorities immediately." Rebecca and David looked at each other. Then they looked at Frost and Nova, who were playing together in the air, doing loops and dives while making happy chirping sounds. "What do you think?" David asked. Rebecca watched Frost catch Nova in midair, both of them tumbling gently before separating and starting the game again. They were so joyful, so alive. The thought of handing them over to some government facility where they would be studied and probably separated made her feel sick. "I think we wait," she said. "Just a little longer." "Until we understand what they are," David nodded. Agreed. Neither of them knew that their decision would change everything. They did not know that Frost and Nova were the first of an ancient race, placed in stasis long ago and waiting for the right species to find them. They did not know about the threat sleeping in the dark spaces between stars, or that these two tiny dragons would grow into legends. All they knew was that something special had entered their lives, and they were not ready to let it go. 3 months had passed since the hatching, and Rebecca could no longer hide Frost and Nova from the authorities. The dragons were now the size of house cats, and they needed more space than a small research vessel could provide. The ship had docked at Gateway Station, and word had spread quickly about the unusual creatures living in the science wing. Gateway Station was a hub where dozens of alien species mixed with humans. The place buzzed with activity day and night, filled with traders, diplomats, and travelers from across the galaxy. Most species got along well enough, but the real power belonged to the Ascendancy, a group of advanced civilizations who had been exploring space for thousands of years, before humans even invented the wheel. Rebecca stood in the station commander's office, with Frost perched on her shoulder and Nova sitting beside David. The commander, a human named Patricia Walsh, looked tired. Across from her sat an Ascendancy representative, a tall being with gray skin and too many fingers. "The creatures must be transferred to Ascendancy control," the representative said. Its voice came through a translator device that made it sound flat and emotionless. "They are potentially dangerous and certainly valuable for study." "They're not creatures," Rebecca said sharply. "They're intelligent beings. Frost and Nova understand everything we say. They have emotions, preferences, personalities." The representative tilted its head. "Irrelevant. The Ascendancy has protocols for handling unknown life forms. Your species is too young to understand the risks," Frost hissed softly, and Rebecca felt a wave of anger that was not entirely her own. The dragon did not like being discussed as if she was not there. Nova's scales began to glow faintly, and the temperature in the room increased slightly. "See?" David said. "They understand exactly what you're saying, and they don't appreciate it." Commander Walsh held up a hand. "Everyone calm down. We need to figure this out diplomatically." She looked at the Ascendancy representative. "What if we keep them here under observation? Human supervision with Ascendancy oversight? Unacceptable," the representative said. "This is not a negotiation." Over the next few weeks, the situation grew worse. The Ascendancy sent more representatives, each one more demanding than the last. They wanted Frost and Nova taken to a research facility on their homeworld. They offered money, technology, even political favors. When humans refused, the offers turned into threats. But something else was happening too. Frost and Nova were becoming part of life on Gateway Station. Children loved them, and the dragons seemed to love children back. They would play gentle games, letting kids ride on their backs as they flew slowly through the large open areas of the station. When a fire broke out in the residential sector, Nova had helped put it out, somehow absorbing the flames into her body. When a child fell from a high walkway, Frost had caught her with a blast of ice that formed a soft landing pad. The dragons were not just intelligent. They were kind, helpful, and protective. People started calling them guardians, and a strange thing happened. Humans who had never cared much about politics suddenly cared very much about what happened to two dragons. David spent his free time building things for Frost and Nova. He constructed a large space where they could fly and play. He made puzzles for them to solve, and he was constantly amazed by how quickly they learned. Nova figured out how to open doors after watching someone do it just once. Frost learned to read simple words by watching Rebecca work. One evening, David was teaching Nova a new game when the dragon suddenly stopped and stared at him. Then slowly and carefully, Nova spoke. "David." The word was rough and came out sounding like a musical note mixed with wind chimes, but it was definitely his name. David froze, hardly daring to breathe. "Did you just say my name?" "David," Nova repeated, more clearly this time. Then she touched his hand with her nose and sent him a feeling of warmth and affection. When Rebecca heard about it, she spent the entire night working with Frost. By morning, Frost could say Rebecca hello, and friend. The dragons were learning to bridge the gap between their species and humanity in the most direct way possible. The Ascendancy did not like this development at all. If the dragons could talk even in a limited way, it became much harder to argue they were just animals. An emergency session was called at the station's council chamber. Representatives from a dozen species gathered to discuss the situation. Rebecca and David were allowed to attend, with Frost and Nova by their side. The dragons were quiet and watchful, understanding somehow that this meeting was important. "We have discovered something troubling," one of the Ascendancy representatives announced. "We searched our oldest archives, records from civilizations long dead. We found a warning." The representative activated a hologram. Ancient symbols appeared in the air along with a translation. "When the twins of ice and flame wake, the silence returns." The room went quiet. "What is the silence?" Commander Walsh asked. "We do not know," the representative admitted. "The records are incomplete. But every civilization that encountered these dragons eventually disappeared. We believe the dragons are connected to something dangerous." Rebecca felt Frost tense on her shoulder. The dragon was afraid, but not of being discovered. She was afraid of something else, something in her own memories. Through their bond, Rebecca caught glimpses of dark space, of things that swallowed light and sound, of worlds going silent forever. "They're not the danger," Rebecca said quietly. "They're the defense against it." Nova made a sound that was half chirp and half word. Silence comes. We guard. Everyone stared at the dragon. Nova looked back at them with steady eyes, and in that moment she seemed much older than 3 months. The Ascendancy representative stood abruptly. "This confirms they must be contained. If they are linked to an ancient threat, we cannot allow them to remain with humans who do not understand the risk." "No," Rebecca said. The word came out harder than she intended. "Frost and Nova chose us. They could have left at any time. They can fly, they can survive in space, they could go anywhere. But they stay here. They stay with us." "Then humanity is foolish," the representative said coldly. Commander Walsh made her decision. Frost and Nova stay. If the Ascendancy has a problem with that, they can take it up with Earth government. But these dragons are under human protection now. The Ascendancy representatives left without another word, but everyone knew this was not over. Lines had been drawn. Humanity had chosen to stand with 2 dragons against the most powerful civilizations in the galaxy. And nobody knew if that choice would save them or doom them. 6 months later, Frost and Nova were the size of horses, and humanity had left the Galactic Council. It had not been an easy decision. But when the Ascendancy demanded humans hand over the dragons or face economic sanctions, Earth government had chosen isolation instead. Some people called it the stupidest decision in human history. Others called it the bravest. Rebecca no longer worked on a research vessel. She now led a team studying the dragons at a facility on Earth, in a valley surrounded by mountains where Frost and Nova could fly freely. The dragons had grown not just in size but in ability. Frost could create ice structures in seconds, building bridges or shelters with just a thought. Nova could generate heat intense enough to melt metal, but controlled enough to warm a room on a cold day. David had become something like an ambassador between dragons and humans. He traveled to different colonies, showing people that Frost and Nova were not monsters or threats. Everywhere he went, the dragons helped. They rescued people trapped in collapsed mines. They found lost children. They even helped farmers by controlling local weather patterns to prevent droughts or floods. But the most amazing thing was how the dragons were changing. They spoke more clearly now, mixing human words with their own melodic language. They asked questions, told stories, and even laughed at jokes. Frost loved learning about human history, while Nova was fascinated by art and music. They had become people, not just intelligent animals. One night, Rebecca was reviewing data in her lab when Frost landed beside her. The dragon had been flying alone, something she did often lately. "Rebecca, I remember things," Frost said. Her voice was clearer now, almost human but with a musical quality that made every word sound like a song. "What kind of things?" Rebecca asked. "Old things. Before the ice. Before the sleeping." Frost's eyes were distant. "We were many once. Dragons filled the sky. We flew between stars, protecting worlds." Nova entered the lab, her scales glowing softly in the darkness. "We guarded against the silence. It came from beyond, from the empty places. It ate everything. Light, sound, life. Whole worlds went dark. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. What happened to the other dragons? They fought, Frost said quietly. They died. Only eggs remained, hidden in ice and stone across the galaxy, waiting for the right time. Waiting for the right people. Why us? Rebecca asked. Why did you choose humans? Nova moved closer and rested her head against Rebecca's shoulder. Because you care. Other species we met in the old memories, they wanted to use us. Control us. Make us weapons. But you, Rebecca, and David, and all the humans we have met, you just wanted to be our friends. That is rare. That is precious. The silence is coming back, isn't it? Rebecca already knew the answer, but she needed to hear it. Yes, both dragons said together. Over the next weeks, Rebecca shared what she had learned with Earth's government. Military advisors wanted to know how to fight the silence. Scientists wanted to understand what it was. Everyone had questions, but Frost and Nova's memories were incomplete. They knew the silence was dangerous and that it consumed everything, but not how to stop it permanently. Humanity began preparing anyway. Ships were built with new weapons designed around dragon abilities. Soldiers trained alongside Frost and Nova, learning to coordinate with beings who could fly through space and manipulate temperature. It was clumsy at first. Humans were used to fighting with guns and missiles, not with living creatures who could freeze or burn enemies from a distance. But humans were good at adapting, and the dragons were patient teachers. Nova showed pilots how to fly in formation with her, using her heat to create updrafts that could boost their speed. Frost demonstrated how her ice could form temporary shields around ships, protecting them from incoming fire. Together, the dragons and humans developed tactics that neither could have created alone. David spent most of his time now at a military training base, but he did not like it. He had not signed up to prepare for war. One evening, he found Nova sitting alone on a cliff watching the sunset. Her scales reflected the orange and red light, making her look like a living flame. "You're worried," Nova said without looking at him. "Yeah." David sat down beside her. "I became an engineer to build things, not to figure out how to fight wars." "I know," Nova said. "I do not like it either. But sometimes we must fight to protect what we love." "The Ascendancy thinks we're idiots for protecting you," David said. "Maybe they're right. We gave up trade, technology, alliances, all for 2 dragons." Nova turned to look at him, and her eyes were ancient and wise. "You gave up those things because you believe beings should not be property. You believe friends do not abandon friends. That is not idiotic, David. That is what makes you human." Before David could respond, an alarm sounded across the base. Everyone rushed to the command center, where urgent reports were coming in. Ships had gone silent at the edge of human space. 3 research stations, 2 mining colonies, and a passenger vessel. All communications had stopped in the same hour. "It's starting," Frost said. She had appeared beside Rebecca, her scales bristling with tension. "The silence has found us." Commander Walsh, who now led Earth's defense coordination, pulled up a map showing where the disappearances had occurred. "They're all on the outer rim. Whatever this thing is, it's testing our borders." "It's not testing," Nova said grimly. "It's feeding. Growing strong. Soon it will come in force." "How long do we have?" Walsh asked. Frost and Nova looked at each other, sharing some silent communication. "Weeks," Frost said. "Maybe less." The room erupted in controlled chaos as people began shouting orders and making plans. Rebecca grabbed Frost's shoulder. "Can we win?" "I don't know," Frost admitted. "In the old memories, we could not stop it. Only slow it down. But we never had humans before. You are strange, Rebecca. Your species is young and small and weak, compared to the great civilizations, but you have something they don't." "What?" "You have stubborn hope. You refuse to give up even when you should. Maybe that will be enough." Frost pressed her head against Rebecca's chest right over her heart. "It has to be enough, because you are my family now, and I will burn the universe to ashes before I let the silence take you." Rebecca hugged the dragon, feeling the warmth radiating from her scales. Around them, humans scrambled to prepare for a threat they did not understand, to face an enemy that had destroyed civilizations far more advanced than their own. It should have felt hopeless. But as Rebecca looked around at the people working together, at David coordinating with Nova, at soldiers and scientists and ordinary people all determined to protect their home, she felt something else. She felt what Frost had described, that stubborn, impossible hope that maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to win. 1 year after the discovery, Frost and Nova had reached their adolescent size, and they were massive. Each dragon was large enough that their wingspans could cover entire buildings. When they flew together, they looked like living storms moving across the sky. Frost left trails of ice crystals that sparkled in the sunlight. Nova's passage warmed the air so much that clouds formed in her wake. The disappearances at the galaxy's edge had continued. Entire planets now went dark, their populations vanishing without sending any distress signals. The pattern was always the same. Communication would stop suddenly, and when ships arrived to investigate, they found empty cities and stations with no signs of violence. Just silence. The Ascendancy, for all their pride and advanced technology, were panicking. Their fleets engaged something at the edge of their territory, but reports were confusing. Some said they fought shadows. Others described tentacles of pure darkness reaching out from nowhere. All agreed on one thing. Their weapons barely worked, and ships that got too close simply stopped functioning, their crews vanishing. A message arrived at Earth from an unlikely source. The Ascendancy requested a meeting to discuss alliance. They wanted to talk about Frost and Nova. The meeting took place in neutral space aboard a massive diplomatic vessel. Rebecca and David attended, along with Earth's military commanders and political leaders. Frost and Nova came too, though they had to remain outside the ship because of their size. They floated in space nearby, surrounded by human escort ships visible through the large windows. The Ascendancy delegation looked different from the last time. They seemed smaller somehow, less confident. Their leader spoke directly to Rebecca. "We were wrong. We treated your dragons as objects when they are clearly people. We treated you as children when you were showing wisdom we had forgotten. We ask for your help." "What do you want us to do?" Rebecca asked. "Fight with us," the leader said simply. "The silence is destroying everything in its path. Our weapons barely slow it down, but we have analyzed the few successful defenses, and they all involved localized temperature extremes. Intense heat or cold seems to disrupt whatever the silence is made of." Through the window, Nova's scales glowed brighter. She could hear everything through her bond with David. "The silence exists between dimensions," she called out, her voice carrying through the communication systems. "It is not truly here, so normal weapons pass through it. But temperature is different. Heat and cold exist everywhere in all dimensions. That is why we can hurt it." "Then help us hurt it," the Ascendancy leader said. "Please." Earth's leaders discussed it briefly, but everyone knew what the answer had to be. If the silence was not stopped, it would eventually reach Earth too. "We'll help," Commander Walsh said, "but we fight as equals, not as your subordinates." "Agreed," the Ascendancy leader said quickly. The combined fleet moved to intercept the silence at a star system that was next in its path. Thousands of ships gathered, human and alien working together for the first time. Frost and Nova flew at the center of the formation, the largest living beings anyone had ever seen. When the silence arrived, it was worse than anyone had imagined. It was not a fleet or an army. It was a wave of absolute darkness that seemed to erase reality as it moved. Space itself twisted and tore where it passed. Ships that got caught in its edge simply ceased to exist, not destroyed, but deleted from the universe. "All ships engage at maximum range," Walsh ordered. "Dragons, you're up." Frost and Nova dove toward the darkness. Frost inhaled deeply and then exhaled a blast of cold so intense that space itself seemed to freeze. Ice formed in impossible patterns, creating a barrier between the silence and the fleet. The darkness pushed against the ice, and for a moment it held. Nova followed with fire. Not the normal red and orange flames, but white-hot heat that rivaled the nearby star. Where her fire touched the silence, it recoiled, pulling back like a living thing in pain. The combined assault drove the entity back, but only briefly. The silence adapted. It split into multiple tendrils, each one reaching around the dragon's attacks. One tendril swept toward a human destroyer. The crew tried to retreat, but they were not fast enough. David watched in horror as the ship touched the darkness and vanished. "No!" Nova roared. She flew faster than David had ever seen her move, putting herself between the silence and another group of ships. The darkness struck her side and she screamed in pain. Her scales cracked and fell away, revealing raw flesh underneath that bled fire instead of blood. Frost was there instantly, covering her sister with a shell of ice. The cold soothed Nova's injuries, but more importantly, it gave her time to recover. Together, Frost said. "We are stronger together." The two dragons flew side by side, creating a storm unlike anything the universe had seen. Frost's ice and Nova's fire mixed and merged, forming a barrier of temperature extremes that the Silence could not cross. Human ships following the dragons' lead began using their own weapons in coordinated strikes. Missiles carrying liquid nitrogen mixed with plasma warheads. The combination worked, pushing the Silence back meter by meter. But the cost was terrible. Ships were lost, people died, and Nova was badly hurt. David could feel her pain through their bond, a sharp agony that made him want to cry out. After 3 hours of fighting, the Silence finally retreated, pulling back into whatever dimension it came from. The victory celebration was brief and quiet. They had won, but everyone knew it was only temporary. The Silence would return, probably stronger next time. Medical teams rushed to treat Nova, though nobody was sure how to heal a dragon. Frost stayed by her sister's side, using her ice to keep the wounds cool and speaking softly in their ancient language. David sat with them, his hand resting on Nova's huge head. "You saved all those people," he said. "You're a hero." "Heroes die," Nova said weakly. "I do not want to die, David. I want to see tomorrow. I want to fly with Frost. I want to help you build things. There is so much I have not done yet." "You're not going to die," David said firmly, though he was not sure he believed it. "We're going to figure this out." Rebecca arrived with medical scanners and a team of doctors. She had been studying dragon biology for a year now, learning how their bodies worked. "The scales will grow back," she announced after reviewing the data. "But it will take time. Weeks, maybe months." "We do not have months," Frost said. "The Silence will return in days." She was right. Reports came in from scouts watching the border. The Silence was massing, gathering strength. Next time it attacked, it would come with more force. And next time, Nova would not be at full strength to help stop it. That night, David stood on the observation deck of the fleet's command ship and watched Frost and Nova floating in space outside. Even injured, they were beautiful. They moved in perfect synchronization, their bond so deep that they seemed like two parts of one being. A voice spoke behind him. "They chose well." David turned to find the Ascendancy leader standing there. "What do you mean?" "Dragons only bond with those who are worthy. In all our old records across thousands of years, we found only 3 species that dragons ever chose to protect. All 3 were wiped out by the Silence, but all 3 fought until the very end, refusing to surrender even when hope was gone." The leader looked at David. "Humanity is the 4th. Perhaps you will break the pattern." "We have to," David said, "because the alternative is unacceptable." 2 months passed and everything changed. Nova's scales had grown back stronger than before, gleaming like molten gold. Frost had also grown, her ice-blue scales now shimmering with an inner light that seemed to pulse with her heartbeat. The dragons had reached full maturity and they were colossal. Their wings could span kilometers when fully extended, and their presence alone could alter local weather patterns. But more than their size had changed. The bond between humans and dragons had evolved into something beyond friendship. When Frost felt determination from the human pilots flying near her, her ice powers grew stronger. When Nova sensed courage from the crews, her flames burned hotter. It worked both ways too. Human soldiers who fought alongside the dragons found themselves calmer in battle, steadier, as if some of the dragons' ancient resilience had seeped into them. Scientists called it sympathetic bonding. Rebecca called it family taking care of each other. The Silence had not returned yet, but scouts reported massive dark spots appearing across the galaxy. Not individual tendrils anymore, but coordinated masses. Whatever intelligence guided the Silence, it was preparing for a full assault on multiple fronts simultaneously. Earth's war room buzzed with activity. Holographic displays showed fleet positions across a dozen star systems. Human ships mixed with Ascendancy vessels, along with other species who had finally decided to stand together against the threat. It was the largest military coordination in galactic history. Commander Walsh stood at the center, coordinating with other fleet commanders. Rebecca and David were there too, acting as liaisons to Frost and Nova. The dragons themselves waited in orbit above Earth, visible through the large windows as 2 enormous shapes circling the planet. "Intelligence estimates we have 6 hours before the Silence attacks," Walsh said. "They're going to hit us at 8 different locations at once. We can't defend everywhere." "We do not need to defend everywhere." Frost's voice came through the communication system. She had learned to use human technology now. speaking directly through ship networks. We only need to strike at the heart. The silence has a heart? Walsh asked. Everything has a center, Nova said. A point where it is most vulnerable. We can feel it now, in the space between dimensions. It calls to us trying to frighten us. But we are not afraid. Rebecca studied the reports. If you're right, and we focus all our forces on one point, the other locations will be undefended. Colonies, stations, maybe entire planets will be lost. Yes, Frost said quietly. But if we spread out to defend them all, we will lose everywhere. This is the choice. Save some by abandoning others, or lose everything trying to save it all. The room went silent. It was Commander Walsh who finally spoke. We strike at the heart. Get me coordinates. Frost and Nova flew down through Earth's atmosphere, landing in the military complex to coordinate directly. Up close, their size was overwhelming. Frost's head alone was larger than most buildings, but when Rebecca approached, the dragon lowered herself so they were eye to eye. You do not have to come, Frost said gently. This battle will be worse than the last. Some of us will not return. Then I definitely have to come, Rebecca said. That's what family does. David was checking his ship, a small fighter specially modified to fly alongside Nova. The dragon had been helping him adjust it for weeks, teaching him how to use her thermal updrafts for impossible maneuvers. Nova's huge face appeared beside his tiny ship, one massive eye watching him work. I am afraid, Nova admitted. Not of dying, but of failing. Of letting down all the people who believe in us. David touched her scaled cheek, his hand insignificant against her massive size. Then we don't fail. Simple as that. The fleet assembled in deep space, far from any inhabited worlds. Thousands of ships formed a formation around Frost and Nova. The dragons had pinpointed the silence's central mass, a point in space where reality itself seemed thin and fragile. When the silence came, it came like a tsunami of darkness. 8 massive waves of void stuff appeared across the galaxy simultaneously, just as predicted. 7 of them moved toward undefended targets, but the 8th, the largest, came directly toward the waiting fleet. It was impossibly huge, a wall of nothing that stretched across light years. Looking at it hurt. The human mind was not meant to perceive something that existed and did not exist at the same time. Sensors went haywire. Some people started crying without knowing why. The silence radiated wrongness on every level. All ships, hold formation, Walsh ordered. Dragons, begin your approach. Frost and Nova flew forward, and as they did, something remarkable happened. Every human in the fleet felt it, a surge of courage, of absolute refusal to surrender. It came from the dragons, flowing through the bonds they had formed with humanity over the past year. Tears stopped. Hands steadied. Fear remained, but it was joined by something stronger. Hope. For Earth, Frost said. For the dragons. For everyone who ever chose love over fear. She inhaled, and the temperature around her dropped to nearly absolute zero. Then she exhaled, and a blizzard erupted from her mouth. It was not just ice and snow. It was a fundamental expression of cold, of stillness, of the deep freeze that existed at the very beginning and end of the universe. The blizzard struck the silence and actually hurt it. The darkness recoiled, writhing. Nova followed with fire, but this was not the white-hot flames she had used before. This was something older, hotter, brighter. This was the fire that burned at the heart of stars, the primal heat of creation itself. Where her flames touched, the silence did not just retreat. It burned away, screaming silently. The fleet opened fire. Missiles carrying temperature extremes, coordinated to hit the exact spots where Frost and Nova had weakened the silence. Human ships and Ascendancy vessels working in perfect synchronization, their weapons timed to the microsecond. The silence split, trying to surround them, but the dragons were ready. They flew in a pattern they had practiced for weeks, weaving around each other, creating a storm of temperature that nothing could pass through. Where Frost's ice met Nova's fire, reality itself seemed to crack, forming barriers that the silence could not cross. David flew through the chaos in his tiny ship, following Nova's lead. He fired missiles at weak points only he could see, gaps that Nova showed him through their bond. Other pilots did the same with Frost, each human working with their dragon partner in ways that defied normal military coordination. Hours passed. The battle raged. Ships were lost. Good people died, but slowly, gradually, the silence began to lose ground. The combined forces were not just fighting it. They were pushing it back, driving it toward the weak point in reality where it had emerged. Rebecca monitored everything from the command ship, her hands flying over controls as she coordinated supply lines and reinforcements. But part of her mind was always connected to Frost, feeling what the dragon felt. The strain was enormous. Frost was using power that her ancestors had not used in thousands of years, burning through energy reserves at a terrifying rate.
"Frost, you need to rest," Rebecca called out.
"Not yet," Frost replied. "Almost there." Nova and Frost flew directly into the heart of the silence, surrounded by darkness so complete that even light could not escape. But they carried their own light. Nova blazed like a sun. Frost gleamed like a star reflected on ice. Together they found what they were looking for. A knot, a core, a point where the silence was most concentrated. "Now," they said together. Every ship in the fleet fired at once. Every weapon, every missile, every particle beam, all targeted at the same point. And at the center, two dragons unleashed everything they had. Fire and ice, heat and cold, creation and stillness all merged into a single catastrophic attack. Reality screamed. Space itself cracked, and the silence shattered. It did not die, not exactly, but it broke, fragmenting into tiny pieces that scattered across dimensions. The massive central intelligence that had coordinated the attacks fell apart. The 7 other waves of darkness that had been heading toward undefended targets suddenly became directionless, easy prey for local defense forces. The fleet cheered. Ships fired their engines in celebration patterns. The silence had been broken, and against all odds they had won. But Frost and Nova did not celebrate. They floated in space, their scales dim, barely conscious. They had given everything, pushed themselves beyond any reasonable limit. Rebecca watched through the windows as medical ships rushed toward them, though nobody was sure what medical treatment a dragon needed.
"Stay with us," Rebecca whispered, knowing Frost could hear her through their bond.
"You saved everyone. Now let us save you." 2 years had passed since the battle that shattered the silence. The galaxy looked different now, rebuilt on principles of cooperation instead of dominance. The Ascendancy had not disbanded, but it had transformed into something more like a council where every species, including humanity, had equal voice. Frost and Nova had recovered, though it had taken months. They spent that time on Earth, in the valley where they had first learned to truly fly. Humans brought them food and energy, though the dragons barely needed it anymore. They had learned to draw power from the stars themselves, basking in solar radiation like plants in sunlight. Rebecca still worked with them, but her role had changed. She was no longer a scientist studying alien life. She was a teacher, helping other humans understand what it meant to live alongside dragons. Because Frost and Nova were not alone anymore. The fragments of the silence had led humanity to something unexpected. As fleets cleaned up the aftermath of battle, they found more eggs. Hundreds of them, scattered across dead worlds and frozen moons, dragon eggs that had been waiting for thousands of years, placed there by ancient guardians who knew that someday, the right species would find them. Not every species could bond with dragons. The Ascendancy tried and failed, their rigid hierarchies incompatible with the dragon's need for genuine partnership. But humans, messy and emotional and stubbornly hopeful, were perfect matches. Young dragons hatched and found human partners waiting, forming bonds that would last lifetimes. David stood in what used to be a military training ground but was now called the Dragon Valley. Dozens of young dragons flew overhead, some no bigger than cats, others already the size of vehicles. Human children ran among them, playing and learning together. It was controlled chaos, joyful and slightly dangerous and absolutely beautiful. Nova landed beside him, her massive form still impressive even though David had long since gotten used to her size. "You are thinking loud thoughts," she said. Dragons had gotten better at human language, though they still sometimes phrased things strangely. "Just remembering how this all started," David said. 2 eggs the size of pinheads. Now look at this place. Do you regret it?" Nova asked. "You gave up a simple life. You will never be just an engineer again." "Not for a second," David said honestly. "You gave me purpose, Nova. You gave all of us purpose." Frost approached from the other direction, Rebecca riding on her back. It had taken practice, but humans and dragons had learned to fly together safely. Rebecca slid down and joined David, watching the young dragons play. "The council wants to meet with us next week," Rebecca said. "They want to formalize the human-dragon partnership. Make it official policy. What do you think?" David asked. I think policy and paperwork can't capture what we have, Rebecca said. But I also think it's important to try. Other species need to understand that this isn't about humans controlling dragons or dragons protecting humans. It's about two species choosing to be family. A young girl ran up to them, no more than 8 years old. A tiny dragon perched on her shoulder, blue scales shimmering in the sunlight. Dr. Hart, Dr. Hart. Snowflake just spoke her first word. That's wonderful, Amy. What did she say? She said, friend. The girl beamed with pride, and the little dragon chirped happily. Rebecca and David exchanged glances. 2 years ago, this scene would have been impossible. Now it was just another afternoon in Dragon Valley. The bonds between humans and dragons had become so common that children grew up expecting to have dragon companions, and young dragons emerged from their eggs already knowing about the kind, stubborn species that had chosen to protect them. But the threat of the silence had not completely vanished. Fragments still existed, contained beyond dimensional barriers by networks of human ships and dragon guardians working in shifts. It was an eternal watch, a duty that would last generations. But humanity had proven capable of thinking long-term, and with dragon lifespans measured in centuries, the guardians would endure. One evening after the young dragons and their human partners had gone home, Frost and Nova took Rebecca and David flying. They soared high above Earth, past the atmosphere and into space where stars blazed with cold fire. The planet curved below them, blue and green and beautiful. We chose correctly, Frost said. Our ancestors placed eggs across the galaxy, hoping that someday someone would find them. Someone worthy. We were the first to wake and we found you. You gave us a gift, Nova added. Purpose, power, partnership. But more than that, you gave us love. Unconditional and true. You gave us the same thing, David said. Before you, humanity was still figuring out its place in the galaxy. We were young and uncertain. Now we know who we are. We're the dragon speakers. We're the ones who choose connection over conquest. Rebecca looked down at Earth, at the lights of cities where humans and dragons live together. It's changing us, isn't it, the bond? Not just culturally, but physically. Yes, Frost admitted. Your children will live longer, feel more deeply, think more clearly. Our presence is altering your species slowly. Is this acceptable? Are you kidding? Rebecca laughed. You're making us better. Stronger, kinder, more connected. That's not a curse, it's a blessing. They flew in silence for a while. 4 beings from 2 species who had become so intertwined that separating them would diminish both. Below, Earth continued its rotation. And on its surface, the first generation of humans and dragons who had never known a world without each other went about their lives. Far out in space, at the dimensional barriers where the silence pressed against reality, human ships and dragon guardians maintained their watch. Among them were children who had grown up in Dragon Valley, now adults who had chosen to dedicate their lives to protecting the galaxy. They flew patterns around the barriers, human and dragon working together with a coordination that seemed almost magical. Because it was magical in a way. Not the magic of fantasy stories, but the real magic of 2 species who had chosen each other against all logic and odds. The magic of connection, of trust, of love that crossed the vast gulf between different forms of life. A new threat would come someday. Frost and Nova knew it from their ancient memories. The universe was full of dangers, and the silence was not the only darkness that lurked in the spaces between stars. But when that threat arrived, it would face not just humans or dragons, but something neither species had been alone. It would face family. Decades later, a ceremony was held in Dragon Valley. The first human born in the new era, a girl who had grown up with dragons as naturally as previous generations had grown up with dogs or cats, was now an adult. She stood before the assembled crowd, human and dragon alike, to receive her formal recognition as a guardian. Frost and Nova attended, now ancient beyond measure, but still strong, still watchful. They had seen so much change, watched humanity spread across the stars with dragons at their side. They had mourned losses and celebrated victories. They had been there for first words and final breaths, for weddings and funerals, for all the moments that made life meaningful. The young woman, whose name was Hope, accepted her guardian badge and then did something unexpected. She pulled out a small ice core sample, no bigger than her fist. Inside it, barely visible, were 2 tiny objects that glinted in the light. We found these on a moon at the edge of explored space, Hope announced. They're dragon eggs. We're going to hatch them, raise them, Welcome them into our family just like our ancestors welcomed Frost and Nova." The crowd cheered. Frost and Nova looked at each other, and through their bond, they shared a single thought. This is legacy. This is immortality. Not through our own lives, but through the lives we touch, the bonds we form, the love we give and receive. As the sun set over Dragon Valley, casting long shadows across the ground, humans and dragons gathered together. Children played while adults talked. Young dragons practiced flying while old ones watched with patient eyes. And at the center of it all, two enormous dragons stood, monuments to the moment when humanity had chosen compassion over fear, when they had looked at two tiny hatchlings and decided to protect them no matter the cost. That choice had changed everything. It had brought species together, ended an ancient threat, and created something new in the universe. A civilization built not on power or territory, but on bonds, on family. And in the evening light, with stars beginning to appear overhead and the sounds of laughter echoing across the valley, Frost and Nova knew that they had found what their ancestors had been searching for across thousands of years and countless worlds. They had found home,